So, morning. Um, Nice to have a chance to see you all. I just woke up a little while ago. My wife has us listening to a meditation group from her new teacher in Korea that now starts at 10 p.m. on Friday evenings and goes till 2 a.m. So we were up paying attention to these teachings until about 2:30 last night. So it was a bit of a long evening. Daylight savings time doesn't help. So, but it's such a fun thing for me to have a chance to listen to these teachings from this teacher who's a really extraordinarily well trained Buddhist scholar, but is presenting everything from a secular point of view. Unfortunately not. So I have the benefit of a live translator, a live in-house translator, which most people do not have the benefit of. So you're getting a trickle-down effect of those Korean teachings translated into English from me. But really, they're 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 Buddhist teachings, but basically taking a fresh look at what is it's basically taking a fresh look at what is the essence of these teachings. And the interesting thing is that if you look at the history of any um, of anything, especially something that is um, so if you so Buddhism's interesting, right? Because it's been around for 2,600 years. It's moved across all kinds of cultures. It's moved across cultures with very different values, very different aesthetics, very different preconceptions of how the world works, and so forth. And in every culture, and the essence of the teachings, though, is trying to change something very deep and very profound inside our mind. It's really this process of watching our own mind, and especially beginning to look at how we generate a sense of self um, within our perception, and how the sense of self causes us to perceive this strong, what you could call a subject object duality, but basically this strong sense of in here and out there. And that's one of the real cores of what Buddhism points out, is that just woven into the fabric of how we perceive the world, our senses orient us towards this strong division, in here versus out there. And that creates these funky effects, psychologically, very problematic effects in the end. That, but then if you want to explain something that's that subtle to such a wide, to a wide audience, to get people in, to help them to understand, and so forth, you often need to couch the teachings in something that people already understand. That's a characteristic of learning. Learning is always based on something that we already understand today, and then taking us a little bit further, right? So these days, the body of knowledge that the average person in society has is very different from the body of knowledge that people had even 50 years ago, or 100 years ago, or 500 years ago, or 1,000 years ago. I credit talk shows with popularizing a lot of like pop psychology. So I feel like, maybe rightly or wrongly, I don't know. I feel like most people in society these days have s- some fluency in like psychological terminology, and everybody's familiar with terms like, with various psychological ailments like depression and anxiety and um, bipolar disorder and these kinds of things. But we're also familiar with a lot of the psychological language about how we interact as a society. And I feel like, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but I'm not sure that that was so common 50 years ago. But a lot of, talk shows come up and they have the couples talk through their problems, or um, give self-help advice. So we have a lot of knowledge about biology that was not common 100 years ago, knowledge of physics and so forth. But most of that knowledge is kind of held at arm's length, right? Like we know about biology, but we don't particularly think about it as it pertains to ourself as a biological entity, for example. Or we know about it. It's also quite hard for, also a lot easier for us to point to other people and where they're making mistakes in their perception rather than noticing ourselves and where we may be making these mistakes in our perception, unless you actually pay for a therapist and they can give you some feedback and personal coaching. And but even that, we have a lot more familiarity in our society than we did a long time ago. So coming back to Buddhism, it's taken a ton of different forms, and the artwork varies, and the language varies, and the examples vary, and so forth. Um, but the essence of it is looking at our own perception from a moment to moment basis, and looking at um, the actual unfolding of our perception, especially the unfolding of this sense of the sense of I versus the world. Because when we, yeah, as I said, when we have this strong sense of in here versus out there, uh, it deeply influences how we perceive the world. So, what do I mean by that? I've used, so we are very much the product of our society without realizing it. We're the product of our biology, um, and the product of our society. And one thing that brings both of those together, of course, is that we're very much the product of our parents, biologically and culturally. But the boundaries of the self are very porous in the sense that all kinds of ideas are coming in all the time. New foods and chemicals are coming in all the time. Um, our biology, even our gut bacteria, determines how we think to a great degree, like the food cravings that we have and so forth are largely determined by our gut bacteria, which is feels bizarre, but um, we are not the independent creatures that we think that we are. And so then the essence of this spiritual practice is beginning to look at our own problems and beginning to trace those back to what is at the root of these problems. The so when I say looking at our problems and tracing back what is at the root of the problems, there's a meditation that I guided on Tuesday, and I'll guide again in this session. But starting just by thinking what's on our mind, because our minds are naturally oriented towards problem solving. We tend to be chewing on things and mulling things over all the time. Uh, and so whatever we're thinking about tends to be related to solving some problem in our life. Personal problem, work problem, worried about a social problem, worried about war, um, pandemics, and so forth, environmental disasters. We think about these things and they generate an unpleasant feeling in our mind. And often we don't even quite realize that that's the dynamic that's happening, right? We think about something, and by thinking about it, it generates an unpleasant feeling in our mind. And so what we're actually struggling with is this unpleasant feeling. So if something doesn't give you an unpleasant feeling, it's not a, you don't personally experience it as a problem. You might experience it as a challenge that needs to be solved, but you don't experience it as a problem. So think about if someone is very, well, I think about, computer problems, for example. Everybody has computer problems generally. Um, if you don't know how to solve the computer problem, it causes you a lot of frustration and stress and worry and anger and whatever else. If you ask someone to solve the computer problem who does know how to solve the computer problem, they see that and they may encounter the same issue, but they don't have an unpleasant feeling. They're like, no problem. They have a pleasant feeling, thinking, I know how to solve this. And so they can immediately step in and begin to fix it. So the outer computer problem is the same, regardless, who's looking at it. But our inability to solve the problem and the frustrated feeling that we have is what we actually call a problem from our point of view. So what's a problem for one person is not necessarily a problem for another if they have a sense of how to solve it. So when we say I have a problem, what we're meaning is that I have an unpleasant feeling about something. And that's what we're really struggling to solve, these unpleasant feelings that arise within our mind. And so just even looking at what we're thinking about and noticing the unpleasant feeling and how it manifests in our body, where we're feeling that unpleasant feeling, and looking at it internally gives us a very different angle on that problem, and then opens up different possibilities for how to solve it. When we're looking at these, so we're sort of tracing things back in. This classic breathing meditation is really just to begin to trace our attention back into our body and also help us to notice where our body gets tense or uncomfortable when we're angry or upset. And then noticing our feelings, a way of noticing where our problems are really coming from and what's the nature of our problems is these unpleasant feelings. But then tracing this back in. At the core of all of this is this sense of a self that is isolated from everything else. Now, you have to confirm that from your own experience. You have to check and see if that's true. And that's the interesting thing. You have to check and see, do we perceive ourselves as an isolated individual? Do we perceive ourselves as like totally separate from the world around us? That's something we have to investigate in our meditation. What happens, though, if we do perceive ourselves as totally isolated from the world around us, what it means is that we're then always bumping into the world around us. Like unpleasant things are hitting us and pleasant things are appearing, and then we're chasing after them. And it feels a bit strange and abstract when I try to explain it this way, but I'm not sure how better to explain this. And so this is the point of trying to investigate our own experience. As soon as you feel like you're separate from the world around you, then you're at risk of these unpleasant objects coming in and hitting you, like some bad news, like an email comes in and it's bad news. And so we become, if you're retired, maybe you don't worry about the emails that come in. If you're working, I think I worry about most every email that comes in, because every email could mean something else I have to do. And so every email is possibly a very unpleasant object. I'm like, please just stop. So if you're working actively, you know what I mean, right? It is these incoming projectiles, right? It's like another problem, another message. Similarly, if what's coming to us are these pleasant objects, you're like, oh, maybe I should do that. Maybe I should do that. Maybe it's all these potential distractions. And this is normally the world we live in, where we're very much separated from everything else. And so you're at risk of unpleasant objects coming in or pleasant objects coming and distracting you. And our mind is very much destabilized by that. Basically, we're moved by the things around us, moved by pleasant things, trying to chase after them, moved by unpleasant things, running away from them. And all of that interferes with our ability to just remain completely at peace. Even for the things that are neutral, neither pleasant or unpleasant, we just want them to continue. We just like we crave the continuity of all of the neutral things in our life. Even though there is no continuity, right? Nothing actually remains. Everything is changing moment by moment. We kind of want the world to just stop, or exist. If we check anyway, and you can, I don't know, you can consider what actually happens in your mind. But normally there is this craving a continuity of phenomena within our own mind. We're wanting everything to stay the same. It gets a little bit like we had some neighbors move out recently. And, I don't think about these neighbors when I'm not seeing them. I don't particularly mind if they're here or not here, but I'm familiar with them, right? And then they move out, and I'm like, oh, that's a shame. I knew them, right? And so there's a little bit of a mild, unpleasant experience where things that we're familiar with disappear. And so many familiar things have disappeared in our life. And there's a little bit of maybe a wistfulness, like a longing for times gone by. Even, even, you know, even things that we didn't experience as pleasant at that time, we still miss them. Anyway, this is the world of our mind. So what we are doing when we're meditating, becoming aware, taking stock of the inner experience. And in this meditation, what we'll do is begin to contemplate the problems that we experience or whatever's on our mind, see if there's a problem, and then trace our way inside, feel how that problem manifests in our body, see if there is some sense of like us, a sense of I being stuck in that problem. And then in particular, if we can go all the way, then we begin to see what is this sense of I that I have? Who do I see myself as in this problem? Do I see myself as for example, a vulnerable person or a person who is overwhelmed? It's very common. Um, if you see yourself as an overwhelmed person, then the things that come in, you don't have any capacity for. And so that sense of ourself, our belief about ourself as overwhelmed, for example, determines how we experience the things that come to us. If we see ourselves as a person who is perfectly capable of meeting whatever new challenge arises, that's a very different version of ourself than the overwhelmed self. So we see what is the version of myself. I say, self, this is an overwhelmed self. And then we can think, you know, uh, we just sort of circle around that, become more aware of that self, and eventually we can begin to question that self and think, am I actually incapable of taking on anything else? I mean, maybe we shouldn't be taking on new projects. That's certainly possible. But this mindset, this feeling like we can't just say no to something, for example. This can manifest as a pain or a suffering in our mind. This ability, this sense that there's too much going on and we can't say no to things. That that's a kind of suffering. So we basically can look at this self. Maybe it's an overwhelmed self, or a vulnerable self, or a powerless self. Or, you have to look at whatever your version of yourself is and think, this is a story. It's a concept of myself. If I change the story, that self disappears and the problems disappear, or the specific problems that I was experiencing at that moment disappear. Okay. So I've talked a lot, I've covered a lot, but it's always the same thing. Probably you're seeing, every class, it's something sort of circling around, very similar concepts. But the point is for us to investigate in our own experience what we actually are seeing and feeling. Okay, so we can take a little bit of time for meditation, trying to settle in and get some sense for this in our own experience, and find your own words to describe. Is one part of the practice. Okay, so we can approach our meditation by sitting up relatively straight to help keep our mind clear, if it's comfortable. And we can close our eyes to reduce distraction. We take a deep breath in and out. Then another breath, just inviting ourselves to relax. And then another breath, just asking ourselves, what is important now? Even just in these few breaths, we may have noticed some feeling of greater calm. And we allow this to kindle and warm up a bit, continuing to focus on each breath, inviting ourselves to relax, asking where we should be putting our focus. And becoming aware of our breathing is not so much thinking about our breathing, it is feeling the breath tactile, in a tactile way. Feeling our breath experientially in the body, and feeling our body as it relaxes, as the feelings change. And then we can just ask ourselves, what is on our mind? Actually inviting the things that we're normally thinking about. What are we chewing over in our life? And when we bring this to mind, perhaps there's some problem in our life that we're pondering, struggling with, or problem in our world. We can begin to look a little bit inside. What is the feeling state that accompanies that? How does that make us feel? If this situation didn't cause unpleasant feelings in our mind, would it be a problem for us? Would we experience it as a problem? Our mind may wander off, but if we ask ourselves, how can we solve our problems? We have to look inside at how we experience them. We can try to look a bit deeper. How do we see ourselves in this situation? What is the version of ourself that is in the midst of this problem? For every situation in our life, for every problem, there is a particular version of ourself that we are experiencing in that problem. And perhaps we just identify what are the characteristics. How do I see myself in that problem? Maybe as an overwhelmed self, or a vulnerable self, or a self that is more important than others. You can check how you see yourself. We can ask if this is the self that is the root of our problems. Is that a permanent self? Is that the self we are in all situations? Is that really who we are? Does that self ever change? Are there different versions of it? So if the self at the center of our problem isn't who we always are, if it isn't permanent, if it's not the only possible reaction we could have, then why do we even think that this is ourself? Why do we even have that sense that that's who we are in the midst of that problem? We just imagine that that self, that version of ourself just disappears. How would we feel? Just all of a sudden, the version of ourself at the root of our problems disappears. So, what happens to those problems? If the version of ourself at the root of our problems is not a real self, it's just a story that disappears, what happens to our problems? And then we can move towards the end of our meditation, just reflecting that even in this brief time we have changed the way we think, learned new ways of examining the mind, and deepened mental pathways. We can recognize that these pathways can be the cause for everyone following similar paths to see through their problems. And we make a decision as we arise from meditation to carry some of this sense of seeing through our problems, examining them and seeing through to their real nature as we go about our daily life. And then we can open our eyes and arise from our meditation.